Let's get a view from Washington. Ivan Eland, what did you make of President Assad's speech, and how is it likely to go down there in Washington, where you are, to an international audience?
Well, I think probably the same way it goes down to the Syrians, as the previous speaker just said. I don't think it's a serious attempt, and I think his words contradict the crackdown that's going on in the coastal cities this previous week. So I think he's responding to pressure. He wants to stay in power, and he's trying to vent the steam from the system, if you'll use the metaphor, and to keep the lid on the situation. But I think, you know, this is probably not sincere, and we have to see what happens. But I think he's in a precarious position. I think the United States government really doesn't know what to do, because they've never really liked Assad, of course, because he's an enemy of Israel. But on the other hand, they feel that they could get something worse. So I think they're very hesitant to throw their lot completely in with the protesters.
Ivan Eland, let me stay with you for a second and just ask you, I mean, how do you think President Assad is reading the situation around him in the region as things stand? I mean, he's seen the leaders of Tunisia and Egypt toppled by popular uprising. Now he's faced with a similar challenge to his rule. Is he as secure as he would like us to believe?
Well, of course, a lot of these dictators live in a bubble, because everyone's afraid to tell them what's really going on. But I think, you know, after Tunisia and Egypt, Libya, and the rest of the unrest in Bahrain, Yemen, etc., that he has to be very worried behind the scenes that this is going to collapse on him. And it seems like the forces are going that way. But we never know what's going to happen. Each country's individual, and we don't know how things are going to go down.
Ivan Eland, what did you read into the timing of Bashar al-Assad's speech? Because on Friday, we saw the biggest protests yet across the country. On Saturday, Assad appears to strike a conciliatory tone and says he's meeting all the demands of the protesters. I mean, the timing was sort of odd, wasn't it?
Well, I think it's not odd at all. I think he's trying to vent the steam from the system. He sees the protests increasing. Before, as we've pointed out, his speech was very defiant. This one was much more conciliatory, and the forces on the ground are pushing him that way. But, you know, as the demonstrations get bigger, he's probably going to make more and more concessions. But at a certain point, you know, push comes to shove, and we see whether the regime survives or not. And I think he realizes he's in trouble.
Ivan Eland in Washington, I want to just gauge some international reaction to President Assad's speech, because the UN and a number of Western governments have heavily criticized President Assad's use of force against the protesters, certainly over the last 2 weeks or so. Has international pressure had any impact on the way he's managed this situation in his country?
Well, I think if you look over the course of revolutions, most of the time we overrate the ability of the international community to affect things on the ground. Certainly it helps, but I think in most cases it's the people in the country rising up and saying that. And of course, he's not satisfying the people demands, because they don't trust him. He's proposed reforms before and never followed through with them. So I think the people are angry, and this anger is very deep. And we, at least in other countries in the Arab world, they haven't been satisfied with token reforms or whatever. And I doubt if they will be in Syria either. And I think the international community is a little bit more willing to press Assad than other countries. But of course, as I say, the United States is still really a bit too timid, I think, because it regards Assad as at least a stability factor. And the United States always favors stability over democracy, no matter what the rhetoric is. That's been the historical, empirical facts of it. And I think the U.S. has been cautious in this case, and the international community has been cautious. Now, of course, there's a limited amount of things they can do, but they can put some pressure on Assad without going overboard, and they.
I mean, Ivan Eland, I wanted to bring back a point that you made, that perhaps it's in Washington's interest to see the status quo remain in Syria, because it pleases Israel, perhaps. We know that the peace process is bogged down. Israel doesn't want regional instability in the Middle East. Israel doesn't necessarily now want to move on the issue of the Golan Heights. So despite the rhetoric that we're hearing from President Obama and people in Washington, will Washington do what pleases Israel in this particular situation?
Well, I think always, and I think the United States follows what Israel would like to see happen. And I think the Israelis are very nervous that they could get something, like Hamas on the northern border if Assad falls. So they don't really like Assad, of course, because they've been at odds with the Assad regime for years. But at least they feel he's secular and he keeps all the chaos down, of course, until recently. And so now they're worried because, they've already seen their southern border. They don't know what's going to happen in Egypt. A lot of times these revolutions don't end up with democracy, but end up with some sort of a different dictator or an even worse Islamist regime or something could happen, of course. So we don't know what's going to happen, and I think countries are conservative in that way, and U.S. will follow Israel.
Ivan, you spoke about what Washington wanted to see, what Israel wanted to see. We haven't touched yet on the Iran factor, because if the protesters start pushing for regime change in Syria, that's bound to worry Tehran, isn't it? Because that affects Iran's regional influence in places like Lebanon via Hezbollah.
Yes, I think the Iranians and the Syrians have had sort of a quasi-alliance in that area, and so I think that's one reason. There have even been reports that the Iranians are helping the Syrians to put down the demonstrations. The other factor, I think, is that Iran has its own internal turmoil earlier in the year, of course, and that was put down, and so they're looking at all these other rebellions going around, and they're probably thinking, well, that could happen again here too. So I think the Iranians have multiple reasons for not really wanting Assad to be overthrown.
Oddly enough, in terms of the international side of things, the situation in Syria is one of the few times that Washington and Tehran seem to want the same thing. So will Assad, do you think, survive this unrest? And what's likely to change if he does?
Well, of course, it's difficult to say, which countries are going to end up overthrowing their leaders and which aren't, but it sure seems that pressure is building in Syria. And, of course, the United States has been very inconsistent. It's been supporting the regime in Bahrain as it shoots protesters, in Yemen as it shoots protesters. Recently, they've moved to a position in Yemen where they're saying he must go. And, of course, that's how it happened in Tunisia and Egypt. We supported the dictator until it was embarrassing to do so, and then we had to go the other way. And I don't think really the United States needs to do that. They think they do for oil reasons in many of these countries, but they really don't. Oil is a free market for oil. Oil is a valuable commodity, et cetera. And of course, oil in Israel underlie U.S. policy toward the region. And I think we see there's no oil in the Syrian case, but of course Israel is there. So we treat Gaddafi the worst way, and we turned around on Tunisia and Egypt. And of course Assad's somewhere in the middle there because we don't really like him, but the Israelis are scared that something might come out around that's worse. So I think there's a pretty good chance Assad may go too here, but we'll have to wait and see how mad people really are, because I don't think they're going to believe that he's going to reform things. And the problem with these dictators is once they start reforming, it's a slippery slope towards being overthrown.